improvements and includes a few new, and in this video we're going to 4.1. Text objects now matches the translation, and there's a new Cambodian translation. Here's the list. You can now rotate images by 90 degrees in the image editor, when in F keys are now a relative up and down movement. One of the biggest changes in Blender 4.1 is the removal of Auto Smooth as a mesh property. This is a pretty big change, but it greatly simplifies. The way it works now is that whether an edge is smooth or sharp is now any other settings. The destructive way to get the old Auto Smooth behavior is to use the Set Sharpness by Angle operator in Edit mode, or the Shade Smooth by Angle operator in Object mode. The non-destructive way is to now use the new Smooth by Angle modifier that's actually a built-in geometry node asset, which is the normals won't have to be were made to the mesh theme so that edges are now more visible and text overlays in the viewport now have more contrast. And the new curves system, which is currently used for geometry nodes and hair, now has the draw curve limit and fall off are now brush specific settings rather than general settings. Some pretty important changes: keyframe for the active keying set. If there is no active keying set, it'll fall back to the new default key channels in the animation preferences. If you want to insert a keyframe other than what's in the keying set, or whatever the default is, then you can use the new hotkey K. To change the active keying set, use Shift K. If the keymap preference pie menu on drag is enabled, holding down I and then dragging gives a pie menu of the common channels to keyframe. This change does mess with my muscle memory a little bit, but making which channels are getting keyed more clear, especially during auto keying, is a welcome improvement. Also, the only insert needed preference can now be enabled separately for auto keying. Motion paths can now be created relative to the active camera, so animators can work more easily in screen space. Bone collections are now hierarchical and can be rearranged and nested with drag and drop. The hierarchy is also now displayed in the outliner. When you're baking actions, you can now bake custom properties and specify which channels to include. You can also bake individual channels in the graph editor. Bone selection in weight paint mode is now a proper selection mode like vertex and face selection if you enter weight paint mode with an armature selected, and there's a dedicated selection tool if you don't want to use the control-click hotkey. Driver property variables now have a fallback value that they can use if the property can't be found, so things will go less haywire if you break them, and failed drivers now have a red underline in the channel list to indicate that they're broken. In the graph editor, a new scale from neighbor operator can help you match a pose on either side of a set of keyframes. You can now right-click on most animated properties and choose View in Graph Editor to zoom to that property's curve if there's a graph editor already open. There's also a new option in the graph editor's View menu to automatically lock keyframe movement to a single axis. Lastly, the dope sheet performance is now significantly better when you have hundreds of thousands or even millions of keyframes. There are 5 new nodes in Blender 4.1 that I'm particularly excited about. Split to Instances separates realized geometry into multiple instances, which is especially great for working with text and motion graphics. Menu Switch lets you build custom drop-down menus that you can use in node groups. Index Switch works like Menu Switch, but with an integer instead of a drop-down. Active Camera returns the scene's active camera object. And last but certainly not least, Bake caches geometry, which can drastically speed up complex meshes. This data is stored with the modifier and not the node itself, so you can safely bake separate meshes that share the same node tree. Node tools can now work in object mode. Baking geometry node simulations no longer drops the previous material assignments, volumes can now be baked, and frames with duplicate data are now much more efficient. The rotation socket, introduced in Blender 4.0, is now used on the distribute points on faces, instance on points, rotate instances, transform geometry, object info, and instance rotation nodes. There's also a new rotate rotation node, which is really straightforward and replaces the rotate Euler node, or resize the node as often if you miss. The extrude mesh node can be up to 6 times faster now, the shortest edge paths node can be at least 60% faster, the face group boundaries node can be over 3 times faster, and the edges to face groups node can be over 7 times faster. The big texture news is that the Musgrave texture node has been completely deprecated. You can't find it in Blender 4.1 because all of its functionality has been added to the noise texture, since they were the same underlying algorithm all along, but with slightly different options. Open image denoise, which is higher quality but traditionally slower than optics denoising, is now GPU accelerated on supported GPUs. Bump map smoothing can now be turned off in cycles so that stylized materials with bump can have sharp shadow terminators. And rendering on the CPU using Linux has been sped up across the board by about 5%. A pretty huge milestone for compositing in Blender has been reached in Blender 4.1 because all nodes are now supported by the Viewport Compositor. The Viewport Compositor now also supports full float precision, though it's set to half by default like the backdrop, and full is only used when rendering, so it stays nice and fast when you're editing. You can change this in the compositor options though if you need to. The keying screen node in the compositor, which I recently learned can be used to vary the key color across a green screen for more accurate keying, has been improved to smoothly transition between the sampled colors. You can now pick cryptomatte colors across different windows. The Kuwahara node now allows for variable sizes, and the Pixelate node now has an explicit pixel size property. The Map UV node can now use nearest neighbor filtering. The Flip and Crop nodes now behave as expected if transformed before the operation, and transforms in the Viewport compositors are now immediately realized so that filters after them also work as expected. The Z Combine and Dilate nodes now have better anti-aliasing, is now anywhere from 50 to 650 times faster when using complex masks. The Split Viewer node is now just a generic split node that has an output that you can use. Lastly, the compositor no longer updates in the background when you're not viewing the result, so there's less wasted calculations. Navigating the video sequence editor timeline is now 3 to 4 times faster when using lots of strips. The glow, wipe, gamma cross, Gaussian blur, and image transformation, color management, audio resampling, and reading and writing FFmpeg were all significantly sped up as well. Pixel filtering when scaling or rotating has been much improved, and the default filter is now auto, which smartly chooses the best filter based on the scaling factor. Oh my word, do we have something to celebrate today. Common 3D file types can now be dragged and dropped right into Blender. It's not every file type yet, but more are coming soon. The PLY importer and exporter for Blender now supports custom vertex attributes. The STL exporter has been rewritten in C++ and is now 3 to 10 times faster than the previous one. Alembic better supports point velocities and camera resolutions, and OBJ now exports objects without custom normals 20 to 40% faster. USD exports now have a scene root by default, lights are now exported with proper limits, subdivision surfaces that are the last in the modifier stack can have their subdiv settings saved in the file rather than applying the modifier and saving all that geometry, which significantly reduces the file size. Armatures and shape keys are now properly exported as skeletons and blend shapes, and USD can now import instances as collection instances. So that's what's new in Blender 4.1. Go download it today from blender.org, and don't forget to support the development fund while you're at it. Again, I'm Jonathan Lampel from CG Cookie, and I can't wait to see all the cool things that are made with this version of Blender. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you later.